Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're zeroing in on something that's kind of the hidden wiring of almost every single conversation you have.
Hmm.
I mean, think about it. Why do we phrase requests so differently, depending on who we're talking to? Why does asking for a favor sometimes feel like, well, such a delicate
Yeah,
dance?
exactly.
We're diving deep into the world of politeness today, but not just like saying please and thank you.
No, much more than that. We're looking at the fascinating underlying strategies we all use constantly.
And our guide for this, our source material, is an article that really walks us through a hugely influential way of thinking about this. The politeness theory developed by Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson.
Often just called BNL, you'll hear us say that, their framework.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today, and we're drawing only from the insights in this article, is to really get to grips with this BNL theory.
Right.
We want to understand its core ideas like this, maybe surprising, concept of face,
Hmm?
and explore the specific politeness strategies they identified, and then look at how this theory has been, used, debated, applied out there in the real world.
Because here's why this matters to you, listening right now. Really understanding these mechanics, these unspoken rules of engagement, it can fundamentally change how you listen, how you speak.
How you navigate things.
Absolutely. How you navigate the whole complex social landscape of communication
Yeah.
every single day.
Okay. So let's set the stage then. What exactly is this Brown and Levinson politeness theory?
Well, the article introduces BNL's work. This comes from their big publications back in 1978, updated in 87, essentially as a framework, a way to explain the how and the why of politeness phenomena.
And it looks at words, but also other stuff.
Both, yeah, verbal language and nonverbal cues, the whole package.
And this isn't some obscure academic thing, right? The article makes a point about its reach.
Oh, definitely not. Its impact goes way beyond just linguistics. This theory is used as like a fundamental tool in fields you might not even expect.
Like what?
Well, economics, for one. Psychology. The article points out there's been a really significant surge in research using the BNL framework just in the last 30 years or so,
Wow.
which really tells you something about its staying power, its relevance.
That is genuinely surprising. So what's the big idea then? At its core, why do people even bother with politeness, according to BNL?
The core assumption, based on the article, is that people generally act the way they do in interactions because, well, they care about maintaining their public self-image.
Ah, okay. Public self-image. And that idea, the self-interaction, that leads us straight to the bedrock of BNL's theory, doesn't it? The concept of face.
Exactly. And the article traces this back to earlier work by sociologist Irving Goffman.
Right, I've heard of him.
Yeah, BNL built heavily on Goffman's ideas from the 50s and 60s. They defined face, and this is their definition, as the public self-image that each individual wants to claim for themselves.
Okay, so it's the me I want you to see.
Sort of, yeah. And it's not static. It's something you're emotionally invested in. It can be lost or maintained or even boosted.
In conversation.
In interaction, yeah. And it takes constant social work to manage it.
And it's not just about me, myself, and I, is it? The article mentions something about it being mutual.
It is, yeah. There's generally a kind of mutual recognition involved. You acknowledge my face needs, I acknowledge yours. It's reciprocal.
Okay.
And BNL break this concept of face down into two key parts, two components.
Okay, first one sounds pretty straightforward. Positive face.
Right. This is basically your desire to be liked, to be improved of, seen as a good person, maybe even admired.
Mm-hmm.
It's the desire for a positive, consistent self-image. The article references Goffman calling it the urge to be seen as the right person. You want your self-image validated by others.
Okay, got it. Wanting to be liked. Then there's negative face. This one always sounds, well, negative. But it's not bad, is it?
Not at all. Yeah, the name is a bit misleading. Negative face is your desire for autonomy, for freedom from being imposed upon.
Ah, okay. Like, leave me alone. Let me do my thing.
Exactly. It's your right not to be disturbed or told what to do, essentially. BNL talk about it as claims to territory, to personal space, your own time, the right to non-distraction. It's wanting to be free to act on your own terms, without pressure.
Okay, that makes sense. So, positive face, wanting approval. Negative face, wanting autonomy, freedom from imposition.
Got it.
And the article makes this really crucial point. People generally cooperate in maintaining face, both their own and others, because face is mutually vulnerable.
Right. It's fragile.
If I step on your toes, face-wise, you might step on mine back, or the whole interaction just breaks down. So we kind of help each other out to keep things running smoothly.
Precisely. It's a fundamental driver for social cooperation, really.
Okay. So if politeness is all about protecting this face, what happens when we have to do something that might, well, damage it?
Yeah. That brings us to the idea of face-threatening acts.
FTAs.
FTAs. Face-threatening acts. Right. And the article defines FTAs, drawing from B&L back in '78. Pretty simply, they're actions that could potentially damage or threaten someone's face, either positive or negative.
And this is key, right? It's not just about the speaker being potentially rude to the listener.
No, that's a critical nuance. An FTA can threaten the face of either person involved, the speaker, or the listener.
Okay.
And it can threaten either the positive face, the need for approval, or the negative face, the need for autonomy.
The article gave some examples that seemed maybe a bit counterintuitive, like expressing thanks or condolences, even making a promise.
Yeah, it can seem subtle. More obviously, things like disagreeing, criticizing someone, making requests, delivering bad news, or issuing demands. Those are pretty clearly potential FTAs listed in the source.
Okay, let's dig into one of those less obvious ones. Why would saying thank you be an FTA? How does that work?
Well, the source implies that thanking someone can sometimes threaten, say, the speaker's negative face, because it acknowledges a debt, making the speaker seem dependent. Or it could maybe threaten the listener's negative face slightly by acknowledging they went out of their way, implying an obligation or cost on their part.
Huh. So it highlights that they did something for you, which cost them time or effort, potentially infringing on their autonomy.
That's one way the source suggests looking at it, yeah, connecting it to negative face. It really depends on the specific context and relationship, of course.
Okay. And a more obvious one, a simple demand. The article uses the example, close the door.
Right. A direct command like that clearly threatens the listener's negative face.
Because it interferes with their desire to remain independent, to not be told what to do.
Exactly. You're directly imposing on their freedom to act otherwise.
Got it. But, I mean, we have to do these things sometimes. We need to ask for things, disagree, give difficult news. You can't just avoid every single potential FTA.
No, absolutely not. Speakers often need to perform FTAs just to get things done in communication. So what they do is they use techniques. Techniques designed to reduce the chance of actually causing harm to face, to soften the blow.
And those techniques, those are the politeness strategies Brown and Levinson identified.
Exactly. They are the ways we try to counteract the unwanted effects of the FTA. Save face, remedy the potential damage, mitigate the risk.
Okay, the politeness toolkit?
Yeah, the article describes them as methods to save face, basically. And it confirms that the four main strategies B&L laid out back then are still seen as, widely applicable today.
All right, let's go through them. First up, the most direct one. Bald on record.
Okay. This is pretty much saying exactly what you mean, as directly, clearly, concisely as possible. Minimal effort to minimize the imposition. Think, pass the salt.
So, zero beating around the bush.
Pretty much zero. The article notes it's often used when the face threat is considered really small or just irrelevant in the situation.
Like an emergency. Watch out.
Exactly. Or maybe you're talking to someone you're extremely close with, where face isn't constantly being negotiated in the same way. Direct imperatives are the classic form here. Although the source does note that even these are often softened with, tiny hedges in actual conversation, little softeners.
The article's be quiet example really hits this home. Saying be quiet is bald on record, totally direct.
Right.
But whether it's polite or impolite depends entirely on the context. A parent saying it firmly to a noisy child, probably acceptable within that relationship, that power dynamic. But a child saying that same phrase to a parent, likely highly impolite. Because the social roles are different, the power is different, and the FTA imposing on the parent's right to speak becomes much bigger.
Context is absolutely everything with bald on record. Massively dependent on who's talking to whom and when.
Okay, strategy number 2, positive politeness.
Right. So this one focuses on the listener's positive face. Remember, that's their desire to be liked, approved of.
So you're being friendly.
Exactly. It's about trying to minimize the social distance between you, showing friendliness, finding common ground, complimenting, making the other person feel good, feel included.
Like, hey, you're so amazing at spreadsheets. Could you possibly give me a hand with this formula?
Perfect example. You're appealing to their positive self-image. You're validating them before you make the request. The article does note that this strategy is sometimes seen as less polite, in a formal sense, than negative politeness.
Why is that?
Because it doesn't always fully back off from the imposition itself. It just kind of frames it in this friendly, group-oriented way. It involves actions that maybe partly meet or align with what the listener wants, and it can even use like inflated expressions of interest or admiration to boost their positive face.
Okay.
You see this a lot among friends or within groups where people know each other well.
Got it. Okay, strategy 3, negative politeness. Now, this feels more like what many people think of as traditional politeness, respecting boundaries.
Yes, I think that's fair. This strategy is specifically aimed at mitigating the threat to the listener's negative face, their need for autonomy, for freedom from imposition.
So less directness.
Much less directness, yeah. It's characterized by being indirect, using hedges. Could you maybe? Apologies. Sorry to bother you, but minimizing the imposition, just a tiny favor. Showing deference, respecting personal space.
When would you use this, typically?
It's often used when there's more social distance between speakers, or maybe when the imposition itself is quite large, or just when you want to put a kind of social break on the interaction to avoid it seeming too pushy or assuming.
Right.
The source points out that B&L actually consider this the real core of this type of politeness behavior. It's all about showing deference and acknowledging the potential burden you're placing on the other person.
Okay, so we have bald on record, super direct.
Yeah.
Positive politeness, friendly, seeking approval. Negative politeness, respectful, non-imposing. What's the fourth one?
The fourth is off record. This is the sneakiest one, maybe?
Uh-huh. How so?
Well, this strategy involves doing the communicative act, like making a request, but in a way that's indirect or ambiguous. It basically leaves the interpretation up to the listener.
So you're not actually saying it, you're hinting.
Exactly, you're hinting. The speaker deliberately makes their intention unclear. This gives them plausible deniability. They leave themselves an out by making the meaning interpretable in more than one way.
What kind of techniques does that involve?
Oh, the source lists quite a few. Things like giving hints. Wow, it's getting chilly in here. Using association clues, presupposing something, understating, it's a bit messy, or overstating, I could eat a horse. Using tautologies like boys will be boys, or contradictions, irony, metaphors, rhetorical questions, who wouldn't want a piece of cake?
Okay, so going back to the window example, instead of a direct bald on record, close the window.
Right.
Or negatively polite, would you mind awfully closing the window? Or even a positively polite, you're sitting right there by the window, could you be a star and close it? You might just say, gosh, it's getting pretty drafty in here, isn't it?
Exactly. Perfect off-record example. You've stated a fact, it's drafty, which the listener can interpret as a hint that you want the window closed. But you haven't actually asked them to do anything. Your request is off-record. They could choose to ignore the hint.
Clever.
The article also mentions less specific off-record tactics, like just being generally ambiguous or vague about what you want.
What's really fascinating here, and the article stresses this, is that B&L's theory isn't just about the words we choose. It applies to politeness in both verbal and nonverbal communication.
That's absolutely right. In verbal communication, sure, politeness shows up in word choice, phrasing, but also in other linguistic features, like how long you speak for, your speed, loudness. But all of that is massively shaped by the sociocultural context. Things like relative power between speakers, their status, age, gender, social distance, family ties, the role they have in that specific interaction. All these things influence how politeness is expressed and how it's understood.
That just makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? Asking a total stranger for the time feels different than asking your best friend. Or asking your kid versus asking your boss.
Totally different calculations involved.
The article's example of where are you going is great for this, that simple question. It could be perfectly normal and polite between friends, or incredibly nosy and impolite from a stranger, depending entirely on the context and who's asking whom.
And think about greetings. A formal "Good morning, Professor Jones" versus a casual "Hey." They signal vastly different social distances and politeness levels straight away. The article even brings up an Indonesian example, where a question like, "Where are you going?" might just get the response, "There," which seems vague to us, perhaps, but illustrates how different cultures handle similar moments with different levels of explicitness, which is considered polite within that specific context.
So what's polite in one culture might genuinely come across as abrupt or even rude in another.
Easily. Big potential for cross-cultural misunderstanding there.
So how does the theory handle nonverbal stuff then? Silence, gestures, things like that.
Well, the article explains that nonverbal politeness signals are basically interpreted using similar principles. You apply the coding techniques from the verbal theory, It's about figuring out the social meaning, the intangible message behind the physical action or even the lack of action, like silence.
Ah,
Oh,
okay.
wow.
So it's not just the gesture itself, but what that gesture signifies in that social context, which is often coded similarly to how a verbal message would be.
Exactly. The source gives examples like silence, when is it silent, polite deference, when is it awkward, when is it rude. Specific gestures, obviously. Giving gifts, even just observing social norms and rules carefully, can be a nonverbal signal of politeness, of respect for the social order.
Right.
And this really hammers home how much politeness is bound up in socioculture. If you're interacting across cultures, you really need to be aware of these potential differences in what signals mean.
And the article points out something important for translation too, doesn't it? Maintaining politeness when you translate isn't just about finding equivalent words.
No, not at all. It's about capturing and somehow conveying the sociocultural function of the original phrasing. What was it doing socially?
Because a straight word-for-word translation could completely miss the politeness nuance or even sound rude.
Yeah, it might fall totally flat or worse.
Okay, so clearly this is a really powerful framework. But like anything this influential, it hasn't escaped criticism or debate. The article touches on that too, especially around this idea of whether it's truly universal.
It does, yeah. B&L did initially propose their theory and the concept of face itself as potentially universal. They drew examples from very different languages.
Hmm.
English, Celtal, which is a Mayan language, Tamil from South India.
Trying to show it worked across the board, but not everyone bought that it applies perfectly everywhere.
Precisely. The source details some of the main lines of critique. Firstly, there's debate about what universality even really means in this context. Is it the concepts, the strategies, how they're used? Critics have also pointed to a possible West-oriented bias in the original model, arguing that it focuses very heavily on individual autonomy and approval, which might not fully capture how face works in more collectivist cultures, where group harmony might be prioritized differently.
Okay, so maybe the definition of face itself isn't universal.
That's one argument. Others find the model isn't quite transparent enough for really explaining politeness across very different cultural systems.
And there were other issues mentioned, like maybe how it handles longer conversations.
Yes. The article notes some challenges with pinning down the precise definition of face in certain applications, and also how the theory, especially in its early form, sometimes struggled to account for politeness phenomena that unfold across longer stretches of discourse, or in interactions without a single clear goal. Think about just casual chat versus asking to borrow a book.
Right. B&L tended to focus more on specific, goal-oriented speech acts, like requests or apologies.
They did, yes.
And the article mentions other scholars have tried to address some of these points, like Leach.
Right. People like Jeffrey Leach, with his grand strategy of politeness and politeness principle, try to modify or build on B&L, perhaps trying to better account for non-Western perspectives or emphasizing the listener's role in evaluating politeness more. The field didn't stand still.
So lots of debate, but what's the takeaway from the source article? Does it still hold up?
It's interesting. Despite all these valid criticisms and the ongoing debates, the article's overall conclusion seems to be that the theory still comes across as, and I quote roughly here, reasonable and efficient for explaining politeness in most languages and cultures.
Huh, so still useful.
Apparently so. It seems to cover many of the common factors that influence our politeness. Choices, power, distance, the size of the imposition, and it remains applicable in lots of different kinds of analysis and circumstances. It's still seen as a foundational paradigm, even with the caveats.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting for me. The applications in the real world. Seeing how this theory gets used beyond just analyzing simple conversations.
Absolutely. The article shows it's been applied in some quite surprising areas. Think about scientific writing, for instance.
Science? Really? To lightness?
Yeah. A researcher named Myers, back in 1989 apparently, used B&L's framework to analyze how scientists actually write academic papers.
How does that work?
Well, it's not just about stating the facts dryly. Scientists use politeness strategies like hedging claims, this suggests that, or acknowledging limitations to manage potential disagreement, to position their claims carefully in a way that respects the face of the established scientific community or potential critics. They're managing social relationships within their field through writing.
Wow. Okay, so even in supposedly objective science, there's this layer of social negotiation happening through politeness strategies. That's fascinating.
Isn't it? And the article highlights other work, too, like Mulholland in 1994, who applied B&L's ideas to analyze persuasion techniques in economic texts.
Persuasion in economics.
Yeah, how do journalists or economists Writing for a general audience, phrase things. How do they try to persuade readers while managing potential disagreement or avoiding seeming like they're imposing a viewpoint too strongly? Politeness theory can shed light on those persuasive tactics.
That makes a lot of sense, using politeness as a lens to see how persuasion works.
And the source also mentions research comparing politeness online versus face-to-face. Do we use the same strategies? Do they work the same way when we're texting or emailing compared to talking in person? How do those dynamics shift in digital spaces?
That's hugely relevant now.
Definitely. Plus, there's the whole aspect of the intentional use of these strategies, particularly by people in positions of power or authority.
Like who?
Well, the article specifically brings up teachers. A teacher is inherently in a position of authority, right? But they might consciously or unconsciously use politeness strategies. Maybe negative politeness, like hedging instructions. And maybe you could try approaching it this way. Or positive politeness by allowing students more turns to speak, showing interest. And they might do this not just to be nice, but strategically, to manage the classroom interaction, to shape meaning effectively, acknowledging the student's face needs even within that power imbalance.
Okay, so wrapping all of this up, pulling it together, how does looking at our everyday talk through this BNL lens actually change how we should think about it? What does this mean for you, the listener, practically speaking?
Well, I think it gives you a really powerful lens, doesn't it? For understanding that layer beneath the literal meaning of words.
Yeah.
It helps you start to see why people phrase things the way they do. You see the invisible social work they're doing, constantly managing relationships, their own self-image, and yours.
It's like suddenly seeing the hidden currents in a river, the social currents flowing through every conversation.
That's a good way to put it. And it offers really crucial insight into potential misunderstandings, especially, as we said, when communicating across cultures or even subcultures, where the preferred strategies for managing face might look very different.
Right. What feels politely indirect and respectful in one context might just feel frustratingly vague or evasive in another.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, it allows you to become more aware, more conscious of your own communication style. Which strategies do you tend to favor? Maybe without even realizing it. Positive politeness. Negative. Do you go off record a lot? And how might your go-to strategies be perceived by different people in different situations, particularly across different social contexts or cultures?
It makes you think about your own habits.
Definitely. Ultimately, I think this deep dive really shows that politeness isn't just some, optional social extra, some surface level etiquette.
No.
It's a fundamental, complex, and deeply embedded system that underpins really the vast majority of our daily human interaction. It's doing serious work all the time.
So there you have it, our deep dive into Brown and Levinson's really influential theory of politeness. We've explored face, those face-threatening acts, the four main strategies, bald on record, positive, negative, and off record, and looked at its applications and the debates around it, all guided by the insights from our source article.
Yeah, we've seen its enduring power as a framework, a way to understand so much of interaction, while also, importantly, acknowledging the valid criticisms and the ongoing conversation about things like universality and its limits.
Thank you, as always, for joining us on this deep dive.
And as you go back out there into the world, navigating all your conversations and interactions from the really trivial ones to the super critical ones, maybe here's a final provocative thought to leave you with, building on that universality debate.
Okay.
If politeness is fundamentally a system for managing social face, and face itself, that sense of self-image, is so deeply tied to our cultural values and how we see ourselves, then how much of what we perceive and perform as polite is driven by some kind of universal human wiring, a basic need to manage social harmony and self-image? And how much of it is actually a highly specific learned performance, something dictated entirely by the particular culture and society we just happen to grow up in? Universal need versus learned script.
Where's the line? That's a great question. Think about that the next time you're trying to figure out the polite way to say something, especially something that just might threaten someone's face.